My arrogant son-in-law shoved me right in front of the courthouse lobby, spilling coffee everywhere, and screaming, "You filthy old man, you are the disgrace of this family." My daughter stood right next to him, turning her face away in silence. When the trial began, all the blood drained from his face as he looked up and saw me sitting authoritatively on the Supreme Court bench. Before we begin, drop a quick comment for me. Have you ever had to stand up to someone you loved because they were doing wrong? Yes or no? Your answer might be what someone else needs. This story includes fictionalized details for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real situations is coincidental. What matters is the lesson it carries. I am Russell Caldwell, 71 years old, and this morning I stood in the marble lobby of the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, watching Jude Harlan, my daughter's husband, a 35-year-old financial lawyer in an expensive charcoal suit, treat me like I was nothing. I said nothing. I pressed my back against the cold marble wall and looked at my watch. 7:30 in the morning, exactly 80 minutes left. 3 meters away, my daughter Luciana, 26 years old, a jewelry designer with her mother's dark eyes and a conscience she'd been trying to silence for 5 years, turned her face from the scene, not toward me, away, as if watching her husband humiliate her father was something she couldn't bear to see, but also couldn't bring herself to stop. "Dad, Her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it, then nothing. She followed Jude toward the courtroom entrance, her heels clicking on marble that still bore the stain of my spilled coffee. The crowd dispersed. The show was over. The pathetic old man had been put in his place, and everyone had work to do. Cases to argue, motions to file, justice to administer. I stayed against that wall for another 30 seconds, counting my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way I'd learned to do when anger threatened to crack the mask I'd worn for 25 years. What did Jude see when he looked at me? A weak old man in a shabby coat, someone whose presence in this building was an insult to its dignity. What would he see in 80 minutes? What would my daughter see? I pushed off the wall and started walking, but not toward the main entrance where Jude had gone, not toward the public corridors where lawyers and plaintiffs and defendants shuffled between courtrooms like cattle. I turned left. The hallway was different immediately, warm yellow lights instead of harsh fluorescence, thick carpet instead of marble, and lining both walls portrait after portrait of judges who had served this court since 1950. Faces stern and dignified, captured in oil paint that had darkened with decades. This was the private corridor, the one only judges knew about. I walked slowly looking at each portrait. Honorable Martin Sheffield, 1950 to 1967. Honorable Catherine Winters, 1968 to 1982. Men and women who had dedicated their lives to the law, who had made decisions that changed lives, who had understood that justice wasn't about revenge, but about restoring balance to a world that constantly threatened to tip into chaos. I stopped in front of my own face. That man looked back at me from the canvas, his expression revealing nothing. He'd learned early in his career that a judge's face must be unreadable. Evidence speaks, law speaks. But the judge must be a mirror that reflects only truth. Judge Caldwell. I turned. Geraldine Marsh stood at the corridor's end, holding something draped over her arm. She was 55 now, the senior clerk who had worked beside me for 20 years before I disappeared from this building. Her hair had gone completely silver, but her eyes sharp and knowing hadn't changed at all. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. I looked back at the portrait one more time. That younger version of myself, the man who'd believed he could separate his identity from his purpose, who'd thought hiding his profession would protect the people he loved. "More certain than I've been about anything in 25 years, I said. Geraldine smiled. It was a small smile, sad and proud at the same time. "I've kept this robe pressed and ready, every month. I knew you'd come back." She held out the black fabric. My robe. My name embroidered inside the collar in gold thread, Russell Caldwell. We walked together to the small changing room adjacent to the corridor. It smelled of old wood and furniture polish scents that triggered memories I'd tried to bury. How many times had I stood in this room, preparing to walk into a courtroom and make decisions that would define other people's futures? Geraldine handed me the robe. The fabric was heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I'd forgotten what authority felt like when you hadn't worn it for 3 years. I slipped my arms through the sleeves. The weight settled on my shoulders, familiar and strange at once. "Courtroom 3 is ready," Geraldine said quietly. "He has no idea." "Is good," I said. There was a small mirror on the wall, the kind that had seen 1,000 judges adjust their appearance before stepping into the public eye. I looked at myself, 71 years old, gray hair that had once been black, wrinkles that told stories of patience and sacrifice, of nights spent alone in a cabin, convincing myself that distance was protection. My hands holding the edges of the robe were steadier than I'd expected. But my eyes were still the same. The robe remembers. Even if the world forgot who I was, this black fabric remembers every verdict, every life I'd changed, every moment of justice I'd delivered from a bench 10 feet above the courtroom floor. I adjusted the collar one final time and looked at myself in that small mirror, the same eyes that had presided over thousands of cases, the same eyes that in exactly 75 minutes would look down at Jude Harlan from the bench in courtroom 3. And he had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him. But to understand what was waiting for Jude Harlan in courtroom 3, you need to understand how I got here, how a man disappears while standing in plain sight for 25 years. The answer begins in 1999 in a kitchen at 3 in the morning. My wife had been dead for a year. Luciana was 13 months old, sleeping in the next room in a crib I'd built myself because I couldn't afford to buy one. The cabin was quiet except for the sound of pages turning as I studied contract law under a lamp that buzzed every few seconds. What I didn't have was a future that looked any different from the present, working myself, to exhaustion coming home to frozen dinners and law books borrowed from the library falling asleep in a chair because I was too tired to make it to bed. "She's 1 year old," I whispered to the empty kitchen. "She'll never remember her mother, but she'll have me. She'll have everything I can build." Luciana was 8 years old by then, old enough to understand that her father had a new job that people called him Your Honor, that he wore a black robe to work instead of the construction clothes she'd grown up seeing. I remember the night I made the decision. She was sleeping in her bed, not a crib anymore, but a real bed with a quilt her grandmother had made. I stood in her doorway watching her breathe, and I thought about what her life would become if everyone knew who I was. "If she knows I'm a judge," I whispered to the darkness, "she'll grow up in that shadow. She'll be the judge's daughter before she's Luciana." I wanted her to have friends who liked her for herself. I wanted her to make mistakes without the weight of my reputation pressing down on her. I wanted her to grow up in love's light, not standing in the shadow of power. So I became invisible. At the courthouse, I was Judge Caldwell. At home, I was Dad who worked in law and didn't talk about it much. I never invited colleagues to the cabin. I never wore my robe outside the courthouse. I built a wall between my two lives and told myself it was for her protection. 25 years of silence. 25 years of choosing to be small so she could be whole. And for what? The question hung in that kitchen every morning for 25 years. But I didn't have an answer until Thanksgiving 2020, when Luciana brought home Jude Harlan. She hadn't warned me she was bringing someone, just called that morning and said, "Dad, I'm coming for dinner, and I'm bringing someone I want you to meet." I spent the afternoon cooking, roasted chicken with herbs from the garden, stuffing made from scratch the way my wife used to make it, apple pie cooling on the counter, filling the cabin with cinnamon and comfort. They arrived at 4 o'clock. Luciana looked beautiful in a blue dress, her dark hair pulled back. And beside her stood Jude Harlan, 30 years old, wearing a suit that probably cost $3,000. He looked at my cabin the way a real estate appraiser looks at a property scheduled for demolition, calculating, cold, taking inventory of every flaw. Cozy. He said, his eyes scanning the worn furniture, the simple wooden table, the walls that needed paint. "Very rustic. How long have you lived here?" 26 years, I said. "Bought it the year Luciana was born." That single syllable carried more judgment than a full sentence. Must have a lot of memories. We sat down to dinner. I'd set the table carefully, my wife's good plates, cloth, napkins, candles. Luciana smiled at me across the table, and for a moment I thought maybe this would be okay. Maybe Jude's coldness was just nervousness about meeting the father. He took 2 bites of the chicken. 2. Then he put down his fork and spent the rest of the meal pushing food around his plate, checking his phone, answering my questions with the minimum number of words required to avoid outright rudeness. After dinner, they stepped outside onto the porch. I started clearing plates, but their voices carried through the screen door. "This dilapidated house proves your father is selfish and doesn't care about your future," Jude said. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, the way you'd point out that the sky is blue. "Can't you do something about that? It gives a bad impression." I stood frozen in my kitchen, holding a plate still warm from food he hadn't eaten. Luciana said nothing. The silence on the other side of that door, my daughter's silence, was the sound of her beginning to believe his lies. They left 20 minutes later. Luciana hugged me at the door, and I searched her eyes for some sign that she'd heard the poison in his words. But all I saw was the careful blankness of someone trying very hard not to think about something. After their car disappeared down the driveway, I went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink. The water ran hot over my hands as I washed plates Jude had barely touched. 2-bite portions scraped into the trash. A pie he'd declined to try. First impressions are deceiving, I said aloud to the empty cabin. He's nervous, meeting the father. It will get better. I washed each plate slowly, carefully, the way my wife had taught me, as if the ritual of cleaning could clean away the unease settling in my chest. This is just a bad first impression, I whispered. Everything will get better. I dried the plates and put them away. I wrapped the untouched pie in foil. I turned off the lights and stood in the dark kitchen, looking at the chair where Jude had sat, barely concealing his contempt for everything I'd built. And deep in my gut, beneath all the hope and rationalization, I knew the truth. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. June 2022. 18 months after that Thanksgiving dinner, 500 candles reflected off crystal chandeliers in a ballroom that cost more than I'd paid for my house, and I sat in the third row like a stranger at my own daughter's wedding. The venue was a 5-star hotel in downtown Philadelphia. White flowers cascaded from the ceiling, in arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly pension. A string quartet played Mozart in the corner, real musicians, not a recording. The invitation had been thick cream cardstock with gold embossing the kind that announced money before you even read the words. I'd received mine via text message 3 weeks before the date. No phone call, no conversation. Just June 18th, 6 p.m., Rittenhouse Grand Ballroom. Wear a suit. I hadn't been consulted about the venue, the guest list, the flowers, the music. Nothing. I'd learned my daughter was getting married the same way you'd learn about a dentist appointment. The usher checked his clipboard when I arrived. Young man, maybe 22, wearing a tuxedo that fit him better than mine had ever fit me. Mr. Caldwell, he said, running his finger down the list. Yes, 3rd row, seat 7, right this way. 3rd row? I followed him through the ballroom past the 1st row reserved for immediate family empty chairs, waiting for Jude's parents. Past the 2nd row, managing partners from Jude's law firm, their wives dripping diamonds. To the 3rd row, sandwiched between people I'd never met. I sat down in seat 7 and looked around at a wedding that had cost, according to whispers I'd overheard near the champagne table, $250,000. My house, the cabin where I'd raised Luciana, where I'd cooked that Thanksgiving dinner Jude had barely touched, I'd bought it for $80,000 26 years ago. This single event, this one night, cost 3 times what my home was worth. How does a father become anonymous at his only child's wedding, 1 seat assignment at a time? The ceremony began. The quartet shifted to Pachelbel's canon. Guests stood. I stood with them, craning to see over the shoulder of the man in front of me, one of Jude's business partners I'd learned from a firm that handled corporate mergers. The officiant took his place at the flower-draped altar. Then Jude walked down the aisle, confident and smiling, looking like exactly what he was, a man who'd gotten everything he wanted. The MC's voice came through the sound system, warm and practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin this celebration, let us honor the families who have brought us together today. The groom's parents, Richard and Constance Harlan. An older couple stood in the front row. Applause rippled through the ballroom. Richard's senior partner at Harlan Ventures. The MC continued, and Constance, board member of the Philadelphia Arts Council and patron of the Philadelphia Orchestra. The applause grew louder. Someone in the back actually whistled. And representing the bride's family, the MC said, his voice somehow flattening, losing its warmth, "We welcome you all." That was it. No names, no acknowledgement of who I was, what I'd done, the 25 years I'd spent raising the woman about to walk down that aisle. Just the bride's family, plural, anonymous, interchangeable. I sat in the 3rd row and felt myself disappear. She walked alone, no father to give her away. That tradition had apparently been deemed old-fashioned, unnecessary, one more detail I'd learned about after the fact. As she passed my row, her eyes found mine, just for a second. Something flickered in her expression, regret maybe, or apology, or just acknowledgement that, yes, I was there, and yes, this was how things were now. Then she looked away, and the moment was gone. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. I heard none of it. I was too busy watching my daughter marry a man who'd spent 18 months systematically erasing me from her life, and I was sitting in the third row like a guest who'd won their invitation in a raffle. The reception began immediately after. Cocktails and hors d'oeuvres circulated on silver trays carried by servers who all looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. I found my assigned table in the back of the ballroom table, 12 near the kitchen doors. My table mates were distant cousins I hadn't seen in a decade. They nodded politely and returned to their conversations about people I didn't know and places I'd never been. At 8:30, Jude's father stood to give a toast. Richard Harlan, silver-haired and commanding, speaking about family legacy and new beginnings and the importance of building something that lasts. Everyone applauded, glasses clinked, cameras flashed. No one invited me to speak. No one asked if the bride's father wanted to say a few words. The moment came and went, and I sat at table 12 with my untouched champagne and let it happen. I was there. I was always there. And somehow that made me more invisible than if I'd never come at all. By 10 o'clock, the party was in full swing. Dancing, laughter. The main dinner still hadn't been served. This was the kind of wedding where cocktail hour lasted 3 hours, and dinner was scheduled for 11. I watched Luciana dance with Jude, watched her pose for photos with his family, watched her laugh at jokes I couldn't hear from table 12 in the back corner near the kitchen. She never looked toward the third row, never searched the ballroom for my face, never seemed to notice or care that I was there. I wasn't in a single picture. It was as if I'd never been there at all. That was just the beginning. In 2024, I counted 7 phone calls from my daughter for the entire year. Each one averaged 4 minutes and 13 seconds. I know, because I started keeping records the way I used to. Track case files, dates, durations, content summarized in bullet points that got shorter every month. July 15th, 2024, 3 minutes, 47 seconds. Hi, Dad, just checking in. How are you? That's good, I have to run, love you. Click. September 2nd, 2024, 5 minutes, 2 seconds. Birthday call. Happy birthday, Dad. Are you doing anything special? Well, I thought maybe. That's great. Listen, I'm at work. Can I call you back later? She didn't call back. December 23rd, 2024, 2 minutes, 51 seconds. Merry Christmas, Dad. We're traveling this year, so I won't be able to visit. Where are you? I'll send you a card. Take care. Click. 7 calls. Total duration, 29 minutes and 31 seconds. My entire relationship with my daughter in 2024 could fit into half an hour. It made me look back to my retirement ceremony in late 2022, the definitive end of my career that had shaped my identity. Judge Russell Caldwell presided over 2,847 cases with unwavering integrity. Irving had said back then, his voice echoing in the formal chamber. Geraldine Marsh sat in the third row crying. I could see her dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief the way she'd cried at every retirement ceremony we'd attended together over the years. She whispered to the clerk beside her. I couldn't hear it, but I read her lips later when I watched the recording someone had made. The front row was reserved for family, 3 seats empty like missing teeth in a smile. Luciana had called 2 days before. Dad, I'm so sorry we can't make it to your retirement thing. Jude has this incredibly important fundraising deal. It's worth over $1 million, and we absolutely can't miss it. You understand, right? It's my retirement, I'd said quietly. After 20 years. I know, and I feel terrible, but this is huge for Jude's career. You get it. You've always understood about work commitments. I looked at those empty seats in the front row, the seats I'd specifically requested, the seats that should have held my daughter, my son-in-law, my family. Irving handed me a commemorative plaque. Bronze heavy engraved with my name and dates of service. Colleagues applauded. Someone handed me flowers, white roses tied with a ribbon. I drove home alone, placed the plaque on the shelf next to my wife's photograph, the flowers in a vase on the kitchen table. And I cried, first time in 3 years. Not because they didn't come, but because I'd finally stopped expecting them to. I sat in my living room that night, the plaque in my hands, and something crystallized in my mind with devastating clarity. I could tell her I was a judge. I could show her the cases I'd decided, the lives I'd changed, the respect I'd earned. I could lay out my entire career like evidence in a trial, and it wouldn't change anything. Because the problem wasn't that she didn't know who I was. The problem was that she'd been taught not to care. Jude had spent 3 years redefining me, not as a Supreme Court justice, not as someone worthy of respect, but as an embarrassment. a burden, a dilapidated house that gave bad impressions. Telling them I was a judge would just give them a different reason to dismiss me. They'd find a way to make it about my failure, my pride, my desperate attempt to matter. I made a decision that night. I would never tell them who I was, not from anger, not from pride, but because I finally understood, to people like Jude, to the version of my daughter he'd created, my identity wouldn't change anything. It would just be something else to dismiss. I would be invisible. I would be exactly what they already thought I was, a simple old man in a wooden cabin who didn't matter. What I didn't know then was that my invisibility would become the sharpest weapon I'd ever used. I'd kept copies of everything from my 20 years on the bench, organized by year, in boxes that lined one wall. I was looking for something, though. I couldn't have told you exactly what. Just a sense that I needed to understand who Jude Harlan really was beneath the expensive suits and contempt. I found it in the 2020 files. The defendant's name jumped off the page like a shout: Jude Harlan, Esquire. Presiding Judge Honorable Russell Caldwell. I sat there for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Then I pulled the full file and started reading. It came back to me in pieces. May 2020. A 30-year-old financial lawyer representing a client in a contract dispute. The plaintiff claimed Jude's client had violated terms of a commercial lease. Jude had filed motion after motion, delay tactics, procedural objections, arguments about jurisdiction that made no sense. I remembered him now. Expensive suit even then. Arrogant in the way young lawyers sometimes are when they think their confidence can substitute for competence. His arguments about contract dates had been fatally flawed. He'd misread the signing date by 17 days and built his entire defense on that error. I'd denied every motion. The trial lasted less than 2 hours. Verdict for the plaintiff. Jude had looked up at the bench when I read the verdict, and I'd seen the expression on his face, shock that anyone had dared rule against him. But he'd never seen my face. The bench sits high enough, the lighting angled enough, that attorneys see the robe, hear the voice, but the judge's features blur into formality. He only heard my name when the clerk recorded it for the transcript, Judge Russell Caldwell. And 5 years later, he'd married my daughter without ever knowing we'd already met. Without ever realizing that the old man he was systematically erasing from his wife's life was the same judge who'd handed him one of his first major defeats. Is it fate when the man who wants to erase you from your daughter's life already failed against you once? Or is it just the universe showing you exactly who you're dealing with? I closed the file and sat back in my chair. The bitter irony was almost beautiful in its cruelty. Almost. I'd commissioned gifts 3 months in advance. October, when the autumn leaves were turning, and I still had some foolish hope that maybe this time would be different. I'd found a craftsman in Old City, Philadelphia, who did custom silver work, the kind of delicate artistic pieces Luciana herself designed for her jewelry company. I'd worked with him for weeks, getting the details right. 2 matching bracelets, child-sized each one, engraved with a name in the same flowing script Luciana used in her own work. Isolde, Henley. I drove to their house on January 14th. Mainline address-gated community houses that cost more than I'd earn in 5 lifetimes. The January cold was brutal, one of those Pennsylvania winters where the wind cuts through everything. I wore a thin jacket because my winter coat had ripped, and I hadn't bothered replacing it. Who did I need to stay warm for? I carried the wrapped gifts to the gate and pressed the intercom. "Who is it?" Jude's voice tinny through the speaker. "It's me, Russell. I brought gifts for the girl's birthday." Silence. Then the gate buzzed and slid open. I walked up the driveway past the Mercedes and the Tesla, parked in front of a house with more windows than my cabin had rooms. The front door stayed closed. Jude appeared at the threshold but didn't open the storm door. Just stood there looking down at me through the glass, looking at the wrapped packages in my hands like they were something contaminated. "We are not receiving guests today," he said, his voice carrying through the door. "And next time you want to see my children, you call ahead first." "I did call," I said. 3 times this week. No one answered. "Then perhaps that should tell you something." I stood there in the January wind holding birthday gifts for 1-year-olds I'd never touched and watched my son-in-law close the door. Not even the storm door, the main door, shutting me out completely. The gate closed behind me automatically as I walked back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a minute, hands on the steering wheel, waiting for the heat to kick in. The wrapped packages sat on the passenger seat beside me. Through the tissue paper, I could see the silver catching the winter sunlight. could see the engraved names I'd chosen so carefully. Isolde, Henley, granddaughters I'd never held. The silver grew cold in my hands, just like everything else he touched. I drove home with those packages on the seat beside me. I didn't throw them away, didn't return them. I put them in a drawer in my bedroom and told myself I'd find another chance to give them. Not to give to my granddaughters, not as gifts rejected at a gate, but as proof of what I'd been, what I'd given, what he'd tried to take from me. That proof came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks after I put those silver pieces in the drawer, the universe handed me something else entirely. April 2025, a Thursday afternoon. The phone screen glowed on my kitchen table, and 14 words destroyed what was left of my world. Fake medical records ready file, conservatorship in 6 months, she won't know until done. Luciana had stopped by, without warning the first time in 4 months. She needed her mother's old insurance documents for some estate paperwork. She'd been distracted rushing through boxes in the spare room while I made tea. She'd left her phone on the kitchen table. I was pouring hot water over the tea bags when the screen lit up. A text message. I wasn't trying to read it, but the words were right there, impossible to miss, glowing in the afternoon light coming through the window. From Jude. I read it once, twice, 3 times, 4. The letters burned into my vision like I'd been staring at the sun. Conservatorship. The legal mechanism where someone is declared mentally incompetent and another person, usually family, is appointed to make all their decisions. Sell their assets, control their lives. The property? He mentioned the cabin, the land my wife and I had bought together in 1999, worth $1.5 million now. And that last sentence, Luciana won't know until done. He was writing it in his own words. My daughter didn't know. She was a victim in this, not an accomplice. I heard Luciana's footsteps in the hallway. I placed her phone exactly where it had been, screen down now, dark, and picked up the teacup like nothing had happened. Found them, she said, holding up a manila folder. Sorry for barging in like this. I know I should have called. It's fine, I said. My voice sounded normal, calm. Tea. I can't, Jude's waiting in the car. She picked up her phone, slipped it into her purse. Thanks, Dad. I'll call you soon. Drive safe, I said. That was the first time I ever lied to my daughter. Drive safe. As if anything about this was safe. The car pulled away. I stood at the kitchen window, watching taillights disappear down the gravel driveway, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 5 years. Clarity. That night, I sat in the living room with all the lights off. Moonlight came through the window, illuminating my wife's photograph on the shelf. I didn't cry, didn't rage. I thought with the same judicial precision I'd used for 20 years on the bench, treating this like case evidence. He's going to declare me incompetent, I said to her photo. Fake medical records, conservatorship petition, sell the property you and I bought together, and he's doing it without Luciana knowing. I'd been asking myself one question for 5 years. Did my daughter choose this? Did she choose to exclude me, erase me, replace me with Jude's version of what a family should be? Now I had my answer, and that message Luciana won't know until done. Conclusion reached with the certainty of a verdict. My daughter was not the perpetrator. She was the second victim. Jude had isolated her from me, controlled her finances, manipulated her reality, and now he was planning to steal everything I had while keeping her ignorant until it was too late. I have to save her from him, I told my wife's photograph, even if she doesn't know she needs saving. How do you save someone who doesn't know they're drowning? You build them a boat they can't see coming. I sat there until the moonlight shifted and dawn started breaking through the trees. Sat there making lists in my head the way I used to prepare for trial. Evidence needed, allies required, strategy. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd kept for 20 years. Grant Whitfield answered on the first ring. He was 50 years old now, an attorney with his own practice in Philadelphia. But in 2005, he'd been 30, and facing 10 years in federal prison for fraud he didn't commit. Corporate embezzlement case. His boss had stolen $2 million and framed Grant with falsified documents that looked airtight. I'd presided over that trial, spent 3 days going through evidence line by line, found the inconsistencies in document timestamps, discovered the boss had access to Grant's credentials. Verdict, not guilty. Grant had walked out of that courtroom a free man. He'd told me then, standing in the corridor outside the courtroom with tears in his eyes, if you ever need anything, for the rest of my life. 20 years later, I was calling in that debt. Wench, I said, my voice steady despite no sleep. "It's Russell Caldwell. I need your help again." Silence on the other end, not hesitation. Wait. The kind of silence that carries 20 years of readiness. "I've been waiting for this call for 20 years, Grant said. "Whatever you need." "It's my daughter's husband," I said. "He's planning something, conservatorship petition, fake medical records. I'll explain everything when we meet." "Tomorrow morning," Grant said immediately. "My office, 7 a.m. "I'll be there." I hung up and sat at that kitchen table where I had read the message 12 hours earlier, where Luciana had stood oblivious while her husband plotted to destroy her father and steal everything we had. Grant said he'd been waiting 20 years for my call. I'd saved him from a decade of wrongful imprisonment when I presided over his fraud case, given him back his freedom, his career, his future. Now, sitting in my kitchen with that message burned into my memory, I understood something. I'd saved him once. Now he was going to help me save my daughter. The next morning, I walked into Grant Whitfield's office and understood exactly what 20 years of success looked like. His firm occupied the entire 12th floor of a glass tower on Market Street, Philadelphia. Panoramic windows overlooking the city, polished mahogany furniture walls lined with framed degrees and case victories. When he opened the door that April morning, I saw 20 years of gratitude in his eyes before he said a single word. "Come in," he said. "Tell me everything." I sat across from his desk and spoke for 40 minutes without interruption. The conservatorship message, fake medical records, 6-month timeline, the property worth $1.5 million, public nursing home. Luciana kept in the dark. 5 years of systematic isolation leading to this moment. Grant took notes in precise handwriting, never interrupting his lawyer's mind, already organizing everything into evidence and strategy. When I finished, he set his pen down and looked at me with the kind of focus I recognized from my own years on the bench. "You saved me from 10 years of wrongful imprisonment in 2005, he said quietly. "Today, I will help you save yourself and your daughter, and we're going to do it the right way with the law as our weapon." "What's the first step?" I asked. "The first weapon they will use is claiming you're incompetent," Grant said. "So the first defense is proving you are completely, unquestionably lucid. Before Jude even knows you're aware of his plan, we build a fortress he can't penetrate." 3 weeks later, I sat in a pristine white examination room at the Pennsylvania Medical Council, undergoing the most thorough evaluation of my mental capacity I'd ever experienced. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice professional but not unkind, "I'm going to ask you a series of questions and conduct several assessments. Take your time with each answer. There are no trick questions. I'm simply evaluating your cognitive function. How do you prove you're sane when someone is preparing lies to declare you incompetent? You let 3 decades of medical science speak for you. For 3 hours, Dr. Forsyth took me through a battery of tests I knew were designed to catch even subtle cognitive decline. Memory recall, she gave me lists of words, asked me to repeat them immediately, then again, 20 minutes later. I remembered everyone. Problem-solving scenarios, complex situations requiring judgment and reasoning. You're given $100 to buy supplies for a dinner party. The store is having a sale. How do you maximize your purchases? I walked through the logic step by step, accounting for variables demonstrating decision-making capacity. Temporal orientation. What is today's date? What year is it? Who is the current president? Easy, automatic. Judgment scenarios. If you saw smoke coming from a neighbor's house, what would you do? I explained the steps. Call 911, alert the neighbors. If safe, stay at a distance, provide information to emergency responders. She tested my ability to understand abstract concepts, to plan for the future, to recognize consequences of actions. Everything a court would look for when determining if someone had the mental capacity to manage their own affairs. I answered every question with the precision I'd once used to write legal opinions. After 3 hours, Dr. Forsyth removed her glasses and sat back in her chair. She'd been making notes throughout the evaluation pages of observations and scores. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and something in her voice made me sit up straighter. "I have done this work for 30 years. I have evaluated thousands of people for mental competency. You are one of the most mentally competent people I have ever tested." She slid a thick report across the table. 15 pages of test results, cognitive scores, professional observations. At the bottom, her signature and official seal. "Your memory is excellent. Your reasoning is sound. Your judgment is clear. Your ability to understand complex information and make decisions is well above average for your age group. She met my eyes. If anyone tries to claim you lack mental capacity, this document will prove otherwise. I signed the assessment report with a hand that was steady, firm, everything Jude claimed I wasn't. That assessment report, 15 pages of cognitive perfection, became my first weapon, but I didn't know yet it would also become my daughter's salvation. 2 days later, I brought the report to Grant's office. He spent 20 minutes reading every page, examining every test result, reviewing Dr. Forsyth's professional conclusions. "Completely clean," he said, finally satisfaction clear in his voice. "Perfect scores across every metric. Russell, this is bulletproof. If Jude tries to file a conservatorship petition, now this document destroys his case before it even starts." I felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. The first piece of legal armor locked into place. Proof that I was exactly what I'd always been, fully capable, completely competent, far from the incompetent old man Jude needed me to be. "So, if he files the petition," I started. Grant shook his head. "This document demolishes his foundational argument. No judge will grant conservatorship when you have a recent comprehensive evaluation from the state's chief medical examiner showing perfect mental capacity." His desk phone rang. Grant glanced at the caller. ID. I saw the name flash across the screen: Conrad Kemp, private investigator. Grant had hired him 2 weeks earlier to look into Jude's financial activities. Just in case, he'd said, "We need to understand everything we're dealing with." Grant answered, listened, his expression shifting from satisfaction to intense focus. He didn't speak, just listened for nearly 2 minutes while I sat across from him, wondering what could change his demeanor so completely. He hung up, placed the phone carefully back in its cradle, looked at me with something I couldn't quite read in his eyes. "Conrad just called," Grant said. "He found something." I waited. "Ann Russell." He continued, his voice careful, measured the way lawyers speak when they're about to deliver bad news they know will hurt. "It's worse than we thought." The next morning, Grant and I stood in Conrad Kemp's office, staring at exactly how bad it was. Conrad Kemp, 45 years old. The private investigator Grant had hired to follow Jude's financial trail spread the evidence across his Old City, Philadelphia office with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 20 years uncovering white-collar crime. The walls were covered with diagrams, photocopied papers, timelines written in red marker. The room smelled like strong coffee and the kind of late nights that come with hunting down people who think they're too smart to get caught. "Your son-in-law set up a shell company," Conrad said, tapping a finger on a registration document. "Apex Design Holdings, registered 18 months ago to a person who doesn't exist. Fabricated social security number. Fake address, the works." He pulled out another document. Bank records, client payment receipts. Luciana's company books showing revenue that should have been there, but wasn't. Client payments to your daughter's jewelry design studio. Conrad continued, laying out the trail like evidence in court. "Get routed through Apex first. The money lands in an account Jude controls. He takes his cut, then transfers the remainder to Luciana's actual business account." "How much?" I asked. My voice sounded distant, like someone else was speaking. I sat down in the chair behind me because my legs suddenly didn't feel steady. $320,000, stolen from his own wife, from the business she'd built with her own hands, designing pieces that her mother would have been proud of. "She has no idea?" Grant asked. Conrad shook his head. "The invoices look legitimate. Payments appear processed. Unless she audited the complete money trail, which most small business owners never do, she'd never know. Jude's handling the finances. Remember, he controls what she sees." I stared at those 47 pages and felt something cold settle in my chest. Jude wasn't just planning to steal from me in 6 months. He was already stealing from Luciana, had been for a year and a half, while she trusted him, while she let him reorganize her business finances because he was better with numbers. How do you steal from your own wife? How do you look her in the eyes every morning knowing you're systematically robbing the business she built with her own hands? "Walk me through it," I said. "I need to understand exactly how this works." Conrad pulled out a specific transaction, laying it in front of me like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Client example," he said. "Wealthy Philadelphia socialite orders a custom diamond necklace for $15,000. She receives an invoice from Luciana Caldwell Design Studio, care of Apex Design Holdings. Pays the full $15,000. He traced the money trail with his pen. Money lands in the Apex account that Jude controls. He transfers $10,000 to Luciana's actual business account, keeps $5,000 for himself. Conrad pulled out Luciana's business ledger. Your daughter's books show a $10,000 payment for a $10,000 project. Everything balances. She has no reason to question it. She never sees the original invoice showing the client actually paid $15,000. And this pattern, Grant said, flipping through pages, repeats for 18 months. Hundreds of transactions, Conrad confirmed. Some he skims 20%, others 40%. Depends on the client the amount how much he thinks he can take without raising suspicion. I looked at those pages transaction after transaction, theft after theft, each one a small betrayal that added up to something monstrous. This wasn't simple theft. This was systematic. Calculated. Sophisticated. Jude had looked at my daughter's business, identified exactly how to exploit her trust, and built an entire criminal infrastructure to steal from her while making her thank him for helping with the finances. $320,000, I said quietly. Is that everything? Conrad and Grant exchanged a glance. I saw it the kind of unspoken communication between investigator and attorney that meant there was another layer they hadn't shown me yet. Conrad's expression shifted from professional to something grimmer. $320,000. That number sat on the table between us, like a bomb no one wanted to touch. I need 4 more weeks to follow the complete money trail, Conrad said carefully. Because there's something else, another pattern I'm seeing in the financial records. Grant leaned forward. What kind of pattern? Conrad hesitated. I'd seen that hesitation before in my courtroom witnesses who'd uncovered something that changed the entire case, trying to find the right words to explain just how bad it was. He set down his pen with deliberate finality, looked me straight in the eyes. The embezzlement is bad, he said. $320,000 over 18 months is serious financial crime, but that's not what worries me most. Then what does? I asked. Conrad pulled out another folder, thicker, more documents I hadn't seen yet. While tracking the money, I found other transactions, irregularities in property records, signature patterns that don't match, documents filed without your daughter's knowledge. Grant's face went very still. What kind of documents? Conrad opened the folder, but didn't spread the papers out yet. Just looked at both of us with an expression that made my stomach drop. Mortgage documents, he said quietly. Property liens, financial instruments that should have required both spouses' signatures. He paused. There's more, Conrad said, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years investigating criminals who thought they were untouchable. And Russell, it's much worse. Grant closed his eyes for just a second. I saw him process what Conrad was implying, saw him understand that the conservatorship plot and the embezzlement were just the surface. The embezzlement was only the beginning. But before I saw any of that evidence, my phone rang. June evening, late afternoon light turning red across my backyard garden. I was sitting on the old wooden bench my wife and I had built together 30 years ago, the one that faced the apple tree. When I saw my daughter's name on the screen, I knew something had finally broken inside her carefully controlled world. I answered. Dad. Her voice was different, not rushed, not performing the 4-minute script we'd followed for 2 years. Trembling. I'm here, I said. Silence. I could hear her breathing, could hear traffic in the background. She was in a car driving somewhere Jude wasn't. I feel like I'm losing my way, she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. My company. Dad, there are numbers I don't understand. Jude said he's handling everything, organizing the finances, making it more efficient, but she trailed off. I waited. 25 years of fatherhood had taught me when to speak and when to let silence do the work. I don't know, she continued. Something feels wrong. I can't explain it. The revenue looks fine on paper, but clients keep telling me they're happy to pay what they did, and I look at the books and the numbers are different, smaller. Jude says I'm remembering wrong, that I'm stressed that I should let him handle it. Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Are you okay? I'm sorry I didn't call more often. I've been, lost. I gripped the phone and forced my voice to stay calm, steady, everything she needed me to be. I'm fine, my dear, I said. I'm always fine, and you're not lost. You're finding your way. The call lasted 23 minutes, the longest conversation we'd had in 3 years. She talked about her work, about designs she was proud of, about clients who'd become friends. She didn't mention Jude again. Didn't mention the numbers that didn't make sense. Just talked to her father like she used to before. When we hung up, I sat in that garden as the sunset turned to darkness. My daughter had just told me she was lost without knowing I was the only one who could find her. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know what. Hadn't been brave enough yet, or maybe hadn't been allowed to be brave enough to dig deeper and find out. That call confirmed everything I'd read in that April message. My daughter was a victim, not an accomplice. It's though or 3 weeks later, I sat in Grant's office at 8 o'clock in the evening, warm yellow light from the desk lamp. Conrad had called both of us in for what he described as the second layer. He spread 47 pages across Grant's desk, mortgage documents, bank records, signature comparisons, forensic handwriting analysis reports. He forged her signature, Conrad said without preamble. $800,000 mortgage on their mainline villa. Your daughter never signed this document, never knew about it. Grant picked up the forensic report reading with the careful attention of someone who'd spent 30 years evaluating evidence. The 95% similarity, he said, practiced, deliberate, but microscopic analysis proves conclusively it's not her hand. Conrad laid 2 signatures side by side. One from a business contract Luciana had legitimately signed 6 months earlier. One from the mortgage document. I leaned forward studying them. They looked identical to my untrained eye. Same flowing script, same confident strokes, same subtle flourish on the capital L. The pressure points are wrong, Conrad explained, pointing to magnified sections of the analysis. When your daughter writes her name, there's a specific pattern to how hard she presses the pen at certain points. Muscle memory, unconscious. This signature mimics the visual appearance perfectly, but the physical mechanics are different. I stared at those 2 signatures, so similar, so carefully practiced. How long, I asked. How long did he sit there learning to write my daughter's name so he could rob her? Long enough to get it 95% accurate, Grant said quietly. $1.3 million. That number would sit in my mind like a weight for weeks afterward. Every hour my daughter had worked building her business, every client she'd won, every design she'd poured her heart into. Stolen. $800,000, I said. He mortgaged their home without her knowledge. Used the money to pay personal debts, Conrad confirmed. Credit cards, investment losses, gambling debts from Atlantic City. Your daughter owns half that house. She's now legally liable for half of an $800,000 mortgage she never agreed to. I sat back in my chair. The embezzlement was one thing, criminal, devastating, but at least contained to business operations. This was different. This was identity theft. Fraud at a level that could destroy her credit, her legal standing, her financial future, even if she divorced him tomorrow. How much in total? I asked. Conrad flipped to the last page of his investigation report. Grant leaned over to read it with him. Then Grant looked at me and read the summary aloud with clinical precision. The number hung in the air like something physical, like something I could reach out and touch. I closed my eyes for 1 second. I opened them. Okay, I said. How much time do we have? When Conrad Kemp answered, Jude Harlan's own legal assistant said 7 words that changed everything. I need to meet with you today. Ronan Vance, 30 years old. He'd worked for Jude for 3 years, handling case files, client communications, document preparation. The kind of assistant who sees everything that crosses a lawyer's desk. He met Conrad at a secluded cafe in a part of Philadelphia where neither of them had connections. No cameras, cash only, corner booth where no one could overhear. Conrad called me and Grant immediately after. We met at his office 2 hours later while Ronan's evidence was still spread across every available surface. Ronan Vance sat across from Conrad in that cafe corner with the look of a man who just realized he was standing in a burning building and he was ready to tell us exactly where Jude had hidden all the gasoline. He'd brought boxes, internal emails showing the shell company setup, forged contracts with Luciana's signature practiced and replicated, payment diversion schedules, client communications routed through Apex Design Holdings. Everything an insider would have access to that an outside investigator could spend years trying to obtain. I've been his assistant for 3 years, Ronan had told Conrad, his voice shaking. I didn't know about the embezzlement until 2 months ago. Found an email he forgot to delete. Started looking deeper. I'm not going to prison for his crimes. What does it mean when your enemy's own soldier switches sides? It means the war is already lost. They just don't know it yet. But the most crucial thing Ronan brought wasn't in the boxes, it was intelligence. He got fake medical records from a suspended doctor, Ronan had said. Fabricated cognitive decline, dementia symptoms, complete mental incompetence. He's going to file the conservatorship petition early, much earlier than he told anyone. Conrad had asked the question that mattered. What timeline are we looking at? He's scared, Ronan said. The account's almost empty. Creditors calling the firm constantly. He needs that property sale, and he needs it now, not in 6 months, now. I stood in Conrad's office looking at 3 years of criminal evidence laid out like a prosecutor's dream, and I understood. The April message saying 6 months had been optimistic planning. Reality was much faster. The emergency meeting happened in early October, late night. Grant's office with all the lights on, coffee going cold in cups we'd forgotten to drink. Grant had news that made the timeline even tighter. Conrad's source gave us the date. He said, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Jude's filing the conservatorship petition in 3 weeks, not 6 months from April, 3 weeks from right now. I sat down slowly. 3 weeks. The 6-month buffer I'd been counting on had collapsed to 21 days. His creditors are circling, Conrad added. Accounts nearly empty. All that money he embezzled, all that mortgage fraud, it's gone. Spent, gambled away. Used to pay other debts. He's desperate for that $1.5 million property sale, and he's desperate now. 3 weeks, from 6 months to 3 weeks. Time had collapsed, but so had my patience. There's something else, Grant said carefully. I was doing background research on Jude's current caseload. He's lead attorney on a major commercial lawsuit. $10 million, high-profile client. The kind of case that makes or breaks a legal career. And I asked. Trial date, Grant said. Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, Courtroom 3. My old courtroom. The one where I had presided for 20 years. There, as Grant continued, is 3 weeks from today. The room went very quiet. 2 timelines, converging. Conservatorship petition, filing in 3 weeks. Major trial in 3 weeks. Same courthouse. Same time frame. Same desperate man trying to steal everything from 2 different directions simultaneously. I sat there processing the convergence, the almost mathematical precision of it, the perfect storm. Grant and Conrad both watched me waiting. Tell me about the case, I said. Commercial dispute, Grant explained. Jude's defending a client accused of contract violations. From what I can see in the public filings, his legal arguments are weak. Procedural errors, statute of limitations issues, the kind of case a good lawyer would settle, but Jude's pushing for trial. Because he needs the win, Conrad said. Needs to prove he's still competent after losing clients. Needs the prestige. Needs something to show his creditors that he's not circling the drain. I stood up, walked to Grant's window overlooking Market Street. The city lights stretched out below thousands of people living their lives, oblivious to the war being planned in this 12th floor office. 3 weeks. 3 weeks until Jude would file paperwork, declaring me incompetent, trying to steal my property, trying to institutionalize me against my will. 3 weeks until Jude would walk into courtroom 3 to argue his case, to try to win his $10 million lawsuit, to try to salvage his imploding career. My courtroom, where I'd presided over 2,847 cases, where Geraldine Marsh still worked as senior clerk. I turned from the window. Call Geraldine Marsh, I said, and call Chief Justice Irving Ashford. Grant understood immediately. I could see it in his eyes, the realization of what I was planning. Russell, he said carefully. Are you absolutely sure about this? I looked at him, at Conrad, at 6 months of evidence spread across tables and filing cabinets, at calendars marking countdown to conspiracy, at the proof of everything Jude had stolen, everyone he'd hurt, every crime he thought he'd gotten away with. More sure than ever, I said. 3 weeks. I have exactly 3 weeks to set the most perfect trap of my life. The first step was the hardest, walking through those courthouse doors, not as a victim, but as a judge. The envelope was already signed when I walked into Irving's office. The same leather-bound volumes of Pennsylvania jurisprudence lined the walls. The same brass nameplate that had been there since 1985. But the envelope on his desk, cream-colored official seal. My name written in formal script, that was new. I signed this 2 weeks ago, Irving said before I could speak. The only question was whether you'd show up to claim it. I looked at the man who'd presided over my swearing in, my career, my retirement. 65 years old now, silver hair and sharp eyes that had seen 40 years of Pennsylvania justice. "You knew I'd come back," I asked. "I hoped," he said. "The Judiciary Committee approved your recall petition unanimously. We don't let men like Jude Harlan win by default." He slid the envelope across the desk. I picked it up, felt the weight of official paper and bureaucratic authority. "Why did you wait?" I asked. "You could have reinstated me the day after Grant filed the petition." Irving leaned back in his chair, the same gesture I'd seen him make 1,000 times, when he was about to say something he'd thought about carefully. "Because men like you don't need rescuing," he said. "They need the right battlefield. Now you have it." 3 weeks isn't much time, Irving said, his voice shifting from ceremonial to practical. "Jude's been preparing this case for months. He knows the arguments, knows the precedents, knows every angle he's going to play." He pulled a thick file from his desk drawer, case number emblazoned across the front. The kind of file that represented months of motions, depositions, legal maneuvering. $10 million, Irving said. "Civil lawsuit? Jude's client is suing on Luciana's behalf, claiming mismanagement of a family trust caused irreparable financial harm to her future." I took the file, heavy, detailed, the kind of case that should have taken years to build. "He's been working this since before the wedding," I said quietly, understanding. "This wasn't opportunistic. This was always the plan." Irving nodded. "The courthouse is yours again. Courtroom 3. Your clerk is waiting." I stood, file under my arm, official reinstatement letter in my pocket. The last time I'd sat in this office was 5 years ago. My retirement ceremony, Irving reading accomplishments to an empty family section. The ceremonial nature of endings. This felt different. No ceremony, just business, just war. I spent the second week of October in my law library. The cabin's second bedroom had been converted 30 years ago, floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with case reporters going back to 1950. Pennsylvania legal code, federal statutes, treatises on civil procedure that I'd studied and taught and lived by for 2 decades. Yellow legal pads, red pens, the same tools I'd used to prepare for every major case of my career. Jude's file spread across my desk, like evidence in a crime scene. And that's what it was, a crime scene. I read every page, every motion, every deposition, every argument Jude had filed over 6 months of pretrial maneuvering. And I found them. 7 fatal flaws. I marked them on a fresh legal pad, building the list, like I used to build closing arguments. 1 incorrect trust jurisdiction. He'd cited Delaware law when the trust explicitly specified Pennsylvania. 2 statute of limitations miscalculation, off by 17 days. Not much, but enough to invalidate half his claims. 3 damages formula. He'd double-counted inflation adjustments, basic mathematical error that any competent opposing counsel would catch in 5 minutes. 4 expert witness, undisclosed conflict of interest. The financial analyst he'd hired to testify about trust mismanagement had consulted for Jude's firm on a different case 2 years ago. Should have been disclosed. Wasn't. 5 discovery violations, 3 requests that violated attorney-client privilege. Any of them could get key evidence thrown out. 6 standing issue. Luciana wasn't a trust beneficiary at the time of the alleged mismanagement. She couldn't claim damages for something she had no legal interest in. 7. The forged mortgage document, authentication chain broken. He'd need 3 witnesses to establish provenance. He'd only listed 1. I sat back in my chair, yellow pad, covered in red annotations, and felt something cold settle in my chest. 7 flaws, I said aloud to the empty library. A first-year associate should have caught at least 3, which meant either Jude was dangerously incompetent, or I was walking into something I didn't see yet. I looked at that list again, studied each flaw, tried to see the pattern. These weren't random mistakes. They were too specific, too technical. The kind of errors that looked accidental but could be fixed with amended filings, updated witness lists, corrected calculations. Maybe he knew. Maybe he'd planted these deliberately, expecting me, or whoever presided to find them, to point them out, to give him the roadmap for fixing them before trial. Or maybe he was just incompetent, arrogant enough to think his confidence could substitute for competence, desperate enough to file a weak case because he needed the win more than he needed it to be airtight. I didn't know which was true, and that uncertainty was the most dangerous thing of all. 7 loopholes. Jude wouldn't be able to plug even one if he came unprepared. Question was he prepared? I wouldn't know if he was prepared until tomorrow, but I knew what I had to do today. I filed the conflict of interest report before Irving could tell me not to. Irving sat to my right, his expression carefully neutral. Russell Irving said after Sylvia had read the entire disclosure twice, "You didn't have to report this. Technically, Jude's representing your daughter, not himself. There's no direct conflict of interest." And when the press finds out after the verdict, I asked. When someone discovers that I presided over a case where my son-in-law was lead counsel, I won't hand Jude that ammunition. If this case is going to stand, it needs to be bulletproof. Sylvia looked up from the paperwork. The plaintiff is your daughter. The plaintiff's attorney is your son-in-law. You haven't had contact with either party for, she checked my statement, over 2 years. Correct, I said. No financial interest in the outcome? None. Harold leaned forward. This is unusual, Russell. Most judges would recuse themselves automatically. The appearance of impropriety alone, the appearance of impropriety, I interrupted, is exactly why I'm disclosing it, transparently, on the record, before trial begins. They deliberated for 2 hours while I sat in the hallway outside. Through the closed door, I could hear the murmur of voices, the occasional raised tone, the sound of precedents being cited, and procedures being debated. When they called me back in, Sylvia had a document prepared. The conflict is disclosed, she said. It's attenuated, you have no direct financial stake, and the attorney-client relationship is between Jude and Luciana, not Jude and you. Under Pennsylvania, judicial ethics rules that's as clean as civil procedure gets. However, Harold added, there are conditions. I waited. Public disclosure at trial opening, Sylvia said. Before any arguments, before any motions, you announce the relationship on the record. You ask both parties if they object to you presiding. If either objects, you recuse immediately. No argument, no appeal, immediate recusal. Agreed, I said. I signed the council's minutes, official record, conflict disclosed, procedures followed, everything by the book, institutional armor in place, the clinical language of ethics oversight, the procedural safeguards, the documentation that would prove if anyone ever questioned it that I'd done everything correctly. That was October 25th at 4 in the afternoon. By 11 that night, I was alone in my cabin, and all that institutional armor felt like paper. I couldn't sleep, not because I was anxious about the legal strategy. I knew the case, knew the flaws, knew exactly how Jude's arguments would fail and where his evidence would collapse. I couldn't sleep because tomorrow morning, my daughter would walk into that courtroom, expecting to see a stranger on the bench. And she'd see her father instead. The father she thought had lived a simple, quiet life in a cabin. The father she'd marginalized, excluded, erased from her carefully curated existence because her husband had told her I was an embarrassment. Tomorrow she'd discover I'd been a Supreme Court justice for 20 years, that I'd hidden my identity not from shame, but from love, that every time she'd dismissed me as irrelevant, I'd been one of the most powerful legal minds in Pennsylvania, and I was about to use all that power to destroy her husband. I sat on the edge of my bed at midnight, looking at my wife's photograph on the nightstand, the same photo that had been there for 26 years, her smile, her eyes that had always seen through every defense I tried to build. Honey, I whispered to that photograph, I hope I'm doing the right thing. 25 years I protected her from the truth. Let her think I was just dad, just the man in the cabin who didn't matter. Tomorrow I take it all back. The photo didn't answer. It never did. But I kept talking anyway. He's stealing from her. He's planning to declare me incompetent, steal my property, institutionalize me. He's systematically destroyed her financial future while making her think he's protecting it. I stood up, paced to the window, looked out at the October darkness, the trees barely visible against the night sky. And she doesn't know any of it. She thinks he loves her. She thinks I'm the problem. The house was so quiet I could hear the old wooden floors creaking under my weight. Tomorrow, she'll see me in that chair and her world will collapse. Not because of the verdict, she won't even understand the verdict at first, but because she'll realize her father has been alive, has been a judge, has been hiding who he is for 25 years. I walked back to the bed, sat down, picked up the photo. Will she forgive me? I asked. Will she understand that I did it because I loved her, that I wanted her to have a normal life, to be loved, for who she was not, because of who I was? The question hung in the dark cabin like something physical. 4 in the morning, I'd been awake for 29 hours. I gave up pretending I would sleep, went to the kitchen, made coffee, spread the case file across the table one more time. Not because I needed to review it. I knew every page, every flaw, every weakness in Jude's arguments. But because my hands needed something to do, the case was solid, the conflict was disclosed, the procedures were followed, everything by the book. The only thing I couldn't control was whether my daughter would ever speak to me again. That question would be answered in 6 hours. But first, I had to become someone else one last time. The beige coat was deliberate. I needed to look like nothing before I looked like everything. 6:30 in the morning, trial day. October 27th. I stood in my bedroom looking at the clothes I'd chosen. Old beige coat. The one with the frayed cuffs and the stain on the left pocket from coffee I'd spilled 3 years ago. Ordinary gray trousers, flat shoes that had lost their shine a decade earlier. The costume from my final performance as the Invisible Man. Jude needed to see this version of me one more time. The shabby old man in forgettable clothes. The father-in-law he'd systematically erased from his wife's life because I was an embarrassment to his carefully curated image. I wanted him to see that man walking into the courthouse. Wanted him to feel that familiar contempt. Wanted him to remember for the rest of his life what he'd been thinking in those final moments before his world ended. I looked at myself in the mirror. 71 years old, gray hair that needed cutting, wrinkles that told stories of patience and sacrifice, and that beige coat, forgettable, unremarkable, the kind you wouldn't notice in a crowd. Beige, I said to my reflection. The color of invisibility. In 90 minutes, it's the last thing Jude will remember seeing before everything he knows collapses. I buttoned the coat, adjusted the collar, let myself feel what Jude would feel when he saw me. Old, ordinary, beneath notice. Everything he thought he was better than. Let him see it, I whispered. Let him feel superior one last time. The fall is always steeper from confidence. This wasn't just clothing. It was theater, psychology. The final staging before the curtain rose on the most important performance of my life. The lobby was crowded, attorneys, clerks, plaintiffs and defendants waiting for their cases to be called. The familiar morning chaos of a courthouse coming to life. I saw them immediately. Jude stood near the security checkpoint, expensive charcoal suit, polished shoes, briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly pension, talking to someone I didn't recognize, another lawyer probably, gesturing with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly challenged. Luciana stood 3 meters away, blue dress, her mother's necklace, looking at her phone with the careful blankness of someone trying very hard not to think about something. I walked toward them, not directly, just crossing the lobby like anyone else heading to the courtroom wing. His shoulder hit mine hard, deliberate. The kind of bump that says, "You're in my way, and I want you to know it." Hot coffee arced across white marble. Brown liquid spreads in patterns that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been designed to humiliate. My arrogant son-in-law shoved me right in front of the courthouse lobby, spilling coffee everywhere and screaming, "You filthy old man! You are the disgrace of this family." My daughter stood right next to him, turning her face away in silence. People stopped walking. Attorneys, clerks, all of them watching the well-dressed lawyer publicly humiliate the pathetic old man who'd gotten in his way. I stood there pressing my back against the cold marble wall and looked at my watch. I said nothing. I just pressed my back against the cold marble wall and looked at my watch. 7:32, exactly 88 minutes until trial began. Then I looked past Jude to Luciana. She was watching, not looking at her phone anymore. Watching her husband humiliate her father with the kind of expression that broke something inside my chest. Not indifference, not approval. Shame. She knew. She didn't want to know, but she knew. Knew her husband was cruel. I knew he enjoyed this. Knew that what she was watching was wrong. But she didn't have the courage to stop it. Or maybe he'd taken that courage from her over 5 years of systematic manipulation. Maybe she'd tried to object once, twice, 100 times, and he'd made her feel like she was the problem for even noticing. Our eyes met. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to see the conflict in her expression. "Dad, She started, her voice so quiet it barely carried. Then nothing. Silence. The way there had been silence for 5 years. "It's all right, Lucy." I thought, holding her gaze for one more heartbeat. "In 88 minutes, you'll understand. I did this because I love you. Even if you never forgive me, I did this because I love you." Jude turned away, laughing with his colleague about something. Luciana followed him toward the courtroom entrance, her heels clicking on marble that still bore the stain of my spilled coffee. The crowd dispersed. The show was over. I stood against that wall for 30 more seconds, watching them disappear into the corridor that led to courtroom 3. Then I turned left. Not toward the public entrance, toward the private hallway, the one only judges knew. 80 minutes left. Jude didn't know the old man in the beige coat had just walked past him for the last time. That hallway led to the robing room, where Geraldine Marsh was waiting. She'd been ironing my robe once a month for 5 years, waiting for a return she had no reason to believe would come. 7:45 in the morning, the judge's dressing room. Small space with oak paneling and a mirror that had reflected 40 years of Pennsylvania jurisprudence. The smell of furniture polish and old leather. Geraldine stood beside the wooden bench where my robe hung freshly pressed, looking exactly as it had the day I'd retired. "I've kept this robe clean," she said as I walked in. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "Wrinkle-free since your retirement. Once a month I take it out and iron it. Don't know why, just felt I should." I looked at her, this woman who'd worked beside me for 20 years, who'd seen me preside over thousands of cases, who'd kept my schedule and filed my opinions, and somehow impossibly kept my robe ready. "You knew," I said quietly. "Somehow you knew I'd need it again." She shook her head. "No, sir. I just believed you wouldn't let men like Jude Harlan have the last word. That's not who you are." She helped me into the robe. The weight settled on my shoulders heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I'd forgotten what authority felt like after 3 years of pretending to be powerless. The fabric was perfect. No wrinkles, no wear, as if I'd never left. I looked at the name embroidered inside the collar in gold thread Russell Caldwell. 20 years I wore this. I said more to myself than to Geraldine. 2,847 cases. Today is the last time. And the most important, Geraldine said, adjusting my collar with the same practiced motions she'd used 1,000 times before. I looked in the mirror, 71 years old, gray hair, black robe that had witnessed justice delivered lives, change wrongs addressed. The same robe, the same man. But everything was different now. "Courtroom 3 is ready," Geraldine said. "They're all there, waiting." "He has no idea," I said. "Good," she replied. 8:55, 5 minutes before trial. My footsteps echoed on polished floors. Each portrait I passed was a reminder. This wasn't about me. This was about something bigger, something that had existed before I'd taken the bench and would exist long after I left it. Honorable Martin Sheffield, 1950 to 1967. I'd read his opinions in law school. Honorable Catherine Winters, 1968 to 1982. I'd clerked for her my first year out of school. The man in that painting looked stern, confident, certain of his purpose. I'd been so young, so sure that justice was about precedent and procedure, about following the law with precision and letting the chips fall where they may. Now at 71, I understood something that younger man hadn't learned yet. Justice wasn't about precedent. It was about showing up when it cost everything. "You were younger," I said to that portrait. "Idealistic. You thought you had it all figured out. Today you learn what justice really means." The portrait didn't answer, but I felt something shift anyway. Permission, maybe, or just acknowledgement that the man I'd been and the man I'd become were both necessary for this moment. I walked on, past the other portraits, past the formal photographs of men and women who dedicated their lives to this work. 20 years I'd walked this corridor. Never once had it mattered this much. Ahead, the heavy wooden door to courtroom 3. Behind it, I could hear the murmur of voices. 60 people waiting for trial to begin. Attorneys, plaintiffs, defendants, witnesses, spectators who'd come because a $10 million case was always good theater. They were all in there. Jude, Luciana, everyone who thought they knew how this would end. I reached for the door handle, brass worn smooth by 100 years of judges entering and leaving, cool against my palm. This was the threshold, the moment between who I'd been pretending to be and who I'd always been. I took one breath, let it out slowly. Then I pushed the door open. The sound hit me first. That particular quality of courtroom noise, papers shuffling, quiet conversations, the rustle of people settling into seats, the ambient sound of justice preparing to commence. Then silence. Absolute, complete. The kind of silence that happens when 100 conversations stop at once. I stepped through the doorway into courtroom 3, my courtroom, the one where I'd presided for 2 decades, the bench elevated 10 feet above the floor, the witness stand, the jury box, the gallery filled with people I couldn't see clearly yet, because my eyes were still adjusting to the formal lighting. but I could feel them. All of them. Every person in that room who'd been talking a second ago and was now holding their breath. The courtroom noise stops when the door opens. I heard, or thought I heard, the sound of everyone holding their breath. 60 people in that room, attorneys who'd argued before me, clerks who'd worked beside me, Jude sitting at the plaintiff's table in his expensive suit, probably wondering why everyone had gone quiet. Luciana sitting in the front row of the gallery, looking at her phone, not yet aware that her father had just walked into the room. Not one of them knew the man in the black robe was the ghost they had spent 5 years forgetting. I stepped through the doorway into courtroom 3. The silence was absolute. Not the silence of empty space, the silence of 50 people holding their breath at once. I heard the creak of leather as someone shifted in their seat. I heard the hum of the overhead lights. I heard my own heartbeat. I walked to the bench, each step measured, each step deliberate. The judicial robe moved with me like a shadow I'd carried for 20 years and only just stepped back into. I climbed the 3 steps to the judge's chair. The wood was darker than I remembered, the leather seat worn smooth by 20 years of other judges sitting where I used to sit. I lowered myself into it. The armrests fit my hands like they had been carved for me. Geraldine Marsh stood to my left. She held the gavel in both hands like it was something sacred. She looked at me once, just once, and I saw in her eyes what I'd seen in the corridor. Not surprise, relief. She struck the gavel, once. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. I watched the room. 50 people stood, chairs scraped, papers rustled, but no one made a sound beyond that. No one spoke, no one coughed, no one moved except to stand. Jude Harlan was at the plaintiff's table, front left, 6 feet from the bench. He was laughing. Not loud, not performative, just laughing, low and easy. Leaning toward his assistant young man, maybe 28 wire-rimmed glasses navy suit, whispering something I couldn't hear. His back was to me. He hadn't looked up. He hadn't heard Geraldine's words, or if he had, the name hadn't registered. His assistant wasn't laughing. The assistant's face had gone white. He was staring at me, not at the bench, at me, at my face, at the nameplate in front of me that read, Judge Russell Caldwell in brass letters 3 inches high. The assistant reached out, touched Jude's shoulder, once, twice, urgent. Jude kept laughing, waved him off, still didn't look up. The assistant squeezed harder. Jude's laugh cut off mid-breath. He turned his head, annoyed, ready to snap at the interruption. Then he looked up. I watched his face. I watched the exact moment he saw me. First there was confusion, a flicker of recognition that didn't quite land, like seeing someone you know in a place they don't belong. His eyes moved from my face to the robe, to the nameplate, and back to my face. Then there was shock. His mouth opened, not to speak. Just opened. His hand holding a pen froze halfway to the legal pad in front of him. Then there was something else, something I hadn't expected to see. Not yet, not this early. Fear. Pure, unfiltered, primal fear. Because Jude Harlan wasn't just seeing his father-in-law, the man he'd spent 5 years humiliating. The man he'd thought was too weak, too old, too irrelevant to matter. The man he'd shoved in a courthouse lobby 90 minutes earlier and called in the way. He was seeing the nameplate. Russell Caldwell. The same Russell Caldwell who'd presided over his commercial lawsuit in 2020. The case he'd lost. The case that had cost his client $400,000 and nearly cost him his partnership. The judge whose face he'd never seen because he'd been too arrogant to stand when the verdict was read. I saw it all happen in his eyes, the 2 recognitions crashing into each other like freight trains. You're alive. You're him. Jude stood, fast, too fast. His chair tipped backward. It hit the floor with a crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. The $10 million case file slid off the table. Paper exploded across the floor. Depositions, exhibits, financial records, spreading like a wave. He stopped. His eyes locked on the nameplate again. Russell Caldwell, he whispered, then louder. The Russell Caldwell, the 2020 case, He didn't finish. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let the silence do the work. Behind him in the gallery, I heard a small sound, a gasp, cut off almost as soon as it started. I looked past Jude, 3rd row, left side, aisle seat. Luciana, she was staring at me. Her phone had fallen from her hand into her lap. She stood slowly, unsteady, like the floor had turned to water beneath her. Both hands came up to cover her mouth. Her eyes were exactly the same as they had been when she was 6 years old, and I had told her that her mother wasn't coming home from the hospital, wide, uncomprehending, searching my face for an answer that would make the world make sense again. I wanted to speak to her, to say her name, to say I'm sorry, or I'm here, or it's going to be all right. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not here. Not while wearing this robe. So I looked at her, just looked, and I let her see in my eyes what I couldn't say out loud. I'm still your father. I never stopped being your father. And everything I'm about to do, I'm doing for you. Jude was still standing, papers still scattered at his feet, his mouth opening and closing, like he was trying to find words that didn't exist. The whole courtroom was frozen. Defendant's table, gallery, court reporter, bailiff. Everyone staring at Jude, then at me, then back at Jude. I let the silence stretch. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then I leaned forward, folded my hands on the bench, looked directly at Jude Harlan, and I said the only 2 words that mattered. Be seated. Jude sank into his chair. The papers stayed scattered at his feet. No one moved to pick them up. I waited until every person had taken their seat, until the only sound was breathing. Before we proceed, I said, I have a legal obligation to disclose a conflict of interest. The room went still, expectant still. I am required to inform this court that the plaintiff's attorney, Mr. Jude Harlan, is my son-in-law. He is married to my daughter, Luciana Caldwell. I paused. The Pennsylvania Judicial Council was notified of this relationship prior to today's proceedings. The council has authorized me to preside. I looked at Jude directly. However, either party has the right to request my withdrawal from this case. If any party wishes to make such a request, you may state it now for the record. Silence. Every eye in the courtroom turned to Jude. I watched him calculate, watched the thoughts move across his face like shadows. If he objected, he would have to explain why. He would have to stand in open court and admit what had happened between us. The lobby, 90 minutes ago, the shoulder bump, the spilled coffee, the words, "You're in the way, old man." He would have to admit in front of 50 witnesses and a court reporter that he had insulted a sitting Supreme Court justice, that he had physically shoved me, that he hadn't recognized me because he'd never bothered to learn what I looked like. Every newspaper in Pennsylvania would have that story by tomorrow morning. Or he could say nothing. Proceed. Face me. 20 seconds passed. Jude's jaw tightened. His hands gripped the table edge. His knuckles went white. Then he shook his head. Once. Sharp. I struck the gavel. Checkmate before the game even started. Jude stood to give his opening argument at 9:05. His voice had changed. The confidence I'd heard in the lobby, the easy arrogance was gone. He spoke carefully. Too carefully. Like a man walking across ice he knew was cracked. He outlined his case. $10 million in damages, breach of fiduciary duty, mismanagement of estate assets. He cited precedents, quoted statutes, gestured to exhibits. I let him finish, 17 minutes. Then I leaned forward. Mr. Harlan, I said, your complaint cites Delaware trust jurisdiction, but the trust instrument page 12 of Exhibit A specifies Pennsylvania as the governing jurisdiction, which applies. Jude blinked, looked down at his notes, flipped pages. The trust was established in Delaware, Your Honor, so where it was established and where it is governed are not the same question, Counselor. The document states Pennsylvania. Does your complaint address this discrepancy? Silence. I'll need to review the instrument language, Your Honor. Please do. I moved to the second flaw. Your complaint alleges a 6-year statute of limitations under Delaware law. Pennsylvania statute is 4 years. If Pennsylvania governs your claim, is time barred by 17 days. How do you respond? Jude's assistant whispered something. Jude shook his head. We calculated under Delaware statute, Your Honor. If the court determines Pennsylvania applies, we would request equitable tolling based on Based on what grounds? Discovery of the breach was delayed due to your client is the trustee's attorney, Mr. Harlan. He had access to all trust documents from the date of execution. On what basis would discovery be delayed? Silence. I let it stretch. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system humming through the ceiling vents. Jude cleared his throat. I'll need to consult the timeline, Your Honor. Please do. I moved to the third flaw, then the fourth, then the fifth. Each question surgical, each answer inadequate or absent. Your damages calculation applies a 3.2% annual inflation adjustment on line 47. Then again, on line 89. Is this double counting, or are these different methodologies sfine im beambastid einilber den sta? Your expert witness, Dr. Raymond Kowalski, his firm consulted for the defendant's parent company in 2019. Was this conflict disclosed in your expert report? You've claimed attorney-client privilege on documents dated before your client retained you. How does privilege apply to communications that predate the attorney-client relationship? Your complaint alleges Mrs. Caldwell had standing as a contingent beneficiary, but the trust amendment naming her wasn't executed until May 2024, 3 years after the alleged breach. How does she have standing for harm that occurred before she was a beneficiary's? Doubt. By 10:30, Jude had stopped trying to answer. He just wrote notes, flipped through files, whispered to his assistant. The courtroom grew quieter with each question, the kind of quiet that has weight, the kind that presses down. I looked past Jude, to the gallery, third row. Luciana was still sitting, still watching, her hands folded in her lap, gripping each other so tightly I could see the tension in her shoulders from 20 feet away. Tears ran down her face, silent, steady. She didn't wipe them away. She just sat there and let them fall while she watched me methodically dismantle the man she'd married. I wondered if she understood yet. The conservatorship, the embezzlement, the forged mortgage, or if she just thought this was about the lawsuit. I wondered if she hated me. I looked away, back to Jude. Mr. Harlan, your Exhibit G is a financial document you claim proves damages, but the authentication chain shows it was scanned, printed, rescanned, and reprinted. The metadata is incomplete. How do you authenticate this document's integrity, says? Jude didn't answer. 11:30. 7 flaws. He hadn't answered even one. I struck the gavel. The words hit like a physical blow. Summary judgment. Not a recess to continue trial. Not a break to let him regroup. Summary judgment. A ruling that the case was so fundamentally flawed, it didn't warrant proceeding to full trial. Jude's face went white. I stood. The room stood with me. I stepped down from the bench and walked to the chamber door. Behind me, I heard nothing. No movement, no whispers. Just silence. And everyone in that courtroom knew exactly what was coming. I closed the chamber door behind me, stood in the empty hallway for a moment, let the weight of the robe settle on my shoulders one more time before I had to remove it. She was sitting on the wooden bench outside courtroom 3, the one against the east wall beneath the portrait of Justice Hargrove. Knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around them, making herself small. Exactly the way she used to sit in my office when she was sick, 7 years old, waiting for me to finish work so I could take her home, curled up in the leather chair by the window, with her knees tucked under her chin, like if she made herself small enough, the fever would forget she was there. 26 years old, and she still sat the same way. I walked toward her. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor. She didn't look up, just stared at the opposite wall, at nothing. I sat down beside her, not close, a foot of space between us, close enough to share the bench, far enough that she could leave if she wanted to. I didn't say anything, neither did she. We just sat there, 2 people on a bench, staring at the same blank wall. I could hear the clock at the end of the hallway, mechanical, old-fashioned, every tick loud in the silence. I counted them without meaning to. 60, 100, 200. 5 minutes passed. I wanted to say something, should say something. But what? Sorry. I've been alive while you mourned me. Sorry I'm about to rule against the man you married. Sorry I let you think your father was dead because I was too proud to tell you the truth. Sorry, I'm a better judge than I am a father. I kept my hands folded in my lap, felt the weight of the judicial robe on my shoulders, wondered if she could see it, if she understood what it meant, what it had always meant. Tick, tick, tick. Then she spoke. I used to sit like this outside your chambers, she said. Her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. When I was sick, waiting for you to finish work so you could take me home. I looked at her. She was still staring at the wall. You'd come out, she continued, and you'd see me curled up in the chair, and you'd put your hand on my forehead to check if I still had a fever. Then you'd pick me up, even though I was too big to carry, and you'd carry me to the car. She stopped, swallowed. I always felt safe when you carried me. My throat tightened. I looked back at the wall. I remember, I said, Another minute passed, maybe 2. Then she turned her head, looked at me. I felt her eyes on the side of my face, but I didn't turn. I kept staring at that blank wall like it held answers neither of us could find. There it was. The question I'd known was coming. The question I'd been asking myself every night for 5 years. I took a breath, let it out slow. Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, I said. Not because I'm a judge, not because of what I could do for you, not because of my position or my power or my connections. I turned to look at her then, met her eyes. Just me, I said, your father, nothing more, nothing less. Her eyes were red, tears on her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. I was afraid, I continued, that if you'd always known, you would love the title instead of the man. That every conversation we had, every choice you made would be shaped by what I could give you, what doors I could open, what problems I could solve. I looked down at my hands, at the robe. I wanted to be your father, I said, not your advantage. Silence, longer this time, heavy. Then Luciana shifted, unfolded her legs, put her feet on the floor, sat like an adult instead of a sick child. You know I've always loved you for who you are, right? She said softly. Not what you do, not your title, not the cases you won or the people you knew. She reached out, put her hand on top of mine. Just you, she said. My dad, nothing more, nothing less. I looked at her hand on mine, felt the warmth of it, the weight. It was the first time she'd said those words without Jude standing beside her. The first time she'd reached for me in 5 years without looking over her shoulder to see if he approved. The first time I heard her voice and truly knew it was hers, not his, not the version of herself she'd learned to be when he was watching. Just Luciana, my daughter. I turned my hand over, held hers. We sat like that for a long moment, not speaking, just holding on. I thought about the younger version of myself. The man who'd taken off this robe 25 years ago and hidden it in a closet because he was afraid his daughter would love the wrong part of him. The man who'd been so terrified of being used that he'd hidden who he was. You were afraid she loved the title, not the man. Now you know, now you can let go. I stood. Slowly, her hand slipped out of mine. I had to go back. The 30 minutes were almost over. The courtroom would be waiting. Jude would be waiting. 50 witnesses and a court reporter. And the weight of justice that didn't care about reconciliation or love or the fact that I'd just gotten my daughter back after 5 years. I had to go deliver the judgment that would save her by destroying her marriage. I took one step toward the courtroom doors. Then I felt her hand again. On mine, gentle, she'd stood up behind me. Dad, she said, her voice stronger now, steadier. I'm sorry. I turned my head, looked at her, saw my wife's eyes looking back at me. Saw the girl who used to sit in my office with a fever. Saw the woman she'd become. I squeezed her hand gently once. Then I let go, turned toward the courtroom doors, and walked back to deliver justice. I pushed open the courtroom doors. The room went silent. Everyone stood. I walked to the bench, climbed the 3 steps, sat in the judge's chair one more time. The verdict I'd written in chambers, while my daughter sat outside on a bench trying to understand why her father had been alive all along. I opened the file, looked around the courtroom one last time. I wanted to remember this moment, the weight of it, the cost. Then I began to read. This court has considered all evidence presented in the matter of Harlan versus Ashford Estate Trust. My voice was steady, clear, the voice of a judge, not a father. I paused, looked up, made eye contact with Jude. He was sitting perfectly still, hands flat on the table, waiting. After reviewing the complaint, all supporting documentation, and oral arguments presented this morning, this court finds that the plaintiff cannot prove the existence of a substantive legal dispute warranting trial. Jude's jaw tightened. The case file contains 7 unexplained procedural and evidentiary gaps. I read them slowly, deliberately. First, jurisdictional inconsistency between complaint citation and controlling trust instrument. Second, statute of limitations calculation error resulting in time-barred claim. Third, damages methodology applying identical inflation adjustment twice without explanation. Fourth, undisclosed expert witness conflict of interest. Fifth, assertion of attorney-client privilege predating establishment of attorney-client relationship. Sixth, plaintiff standing issue for harm occurring prior to beneficiary designation. Seventh, broken authentication chain for documentary evidence. Each gap corresponding exactly to the 7 flaws I'd found in. I turned the page. I looked up, met Jude's eyes. All claims are dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiff will bear all litigation costs, including defendant's reasonable attorney fees. I picked up the gavel. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck the sound block. The crack echoed through the courtroom like thunder. For 3 seconds, absolute silence. Then chaos. Voices, movement. Jude's chair scraping backwards so hard it nearly tipped. His assistant grabbing papers. The defense table erupting in controlled celebration. Gallery witnesses turning to each other whispering. I stood. The room stood with me. I looked at Jude one more time. His face had gone white. Not pale. White. Like all the blood had drained out of him at once. 20 years on this bench. Hundreds of verdicts. Thousands of cases. This was the only one that would cost me everything that mattered. I stepped down from the bench, walked to the chamber door, removed the robe, hung it on the hook where it had hung for 20 years before I retired, where it would hang now until someone else needed it. Then I walked out, through the private corridor, out to the main hallway, toward the exit. I heard footsteps behind me, fast, heavy, running. You old fox. I turned. Jude was coming at me, not walking, charging, his face twisted, red now instead of white, eyes wild. You pretended to be weak, he was shouting. People in the hallway stopped, stared. Played dead for 5 years just to trap me. You set this whole thing up. He lunged forward, reached for me. A hand caught his arm, pulled him back, hard. Sir, you need to step back. The voice was calm, professional, firm. Perry Townsend, court security officer, 15-year veteran. I'd seen him handle emotional family court verdicts, criminal sentencing outbursts, custody disputes that ended in screaming matches. He was trained for this. De-escalation. Control without violence. He kept his hand on Jude's arm, not squeezing, just holding, creating distance. Jude tried to pull away. Couldn't. Perry's grip was steady. You trapped me? Jude's voice cracked. You knew I didn't recognize you. You knew I'd file this case. You set me up. Ons I vår besittningsdag. I looked at him, really looked at him. At the man my daughter had married, the man who'd spent 5 years humiliating me because I was old, because I didn't have money, because I didn't fight back when he pushed me aside. The man who'd assumed weakness meant powerless. I stepped closer, not threatening. Just close enough that he had to look up slightly to meet my eyes. Close enough that he could see I wasn't afraid. Had never been afraid. I didn't pretend to be weak, Jude, I said quietly. You only assumed I was weak because I was old, because I didn't fight back in that lobby this morning, because I let you push me aside without saying a word. I held his gaze. And you were wrong. Jude's face changed, the anger cracking. Something else underneath, something that looked like fear. I saw it then. What Luciana must have lived with for 5 years. The mask. The confident financial lawyer who knew all the answers, who controlled every room, who made her feel small every time she questioned him. And underneath this, desperate panic. The ice breaking under weight it was never meant to hold. I looked past him, down the hallway. Luciana was standing there, 30 feet away, watching. She'd followed us out of the courtroom, watched Jude lunge at me, watched him lose control completely. Watched the man she'd married reveal exactly who he was when he lost. Our eyes met, hers and mine, for just a moment. Then I turned away, from Jude, from Perry holding him back, from the small crowd that had gathered to watch. I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Behind me I heard it, the sharp click of heels, hurrying, getting closer. My daughter, running toward me down the hallway. I didn't turn around. I didn't know if she was coming to thank me or to say goodbye forever. She caught up to me before I reached the exit, put her hand on my arm. I turned. She didn't say anything, just looked at me. Then she nodded once and let go. That evening, I made a phone call. The headline covered half the front page the next morning. Recalled senior judge presides over case. Involving son-in-law, verdict all claims dismissed. I read it sitting at my kitchen table with coffee I'd made at 5 in the morning because I couldn't sleep. The article was factual, precise, exactly what I'd given them when I called the legal affairs reporter at 8 o'clock the night before. Pennsylvania Supreme Court, Justice Russell Caldwell, retired 2022, was recalled to active service October 2025. First case assigned Harlan versus Ashford Estate Trust. Plaintiff's attorney, Jude Harlan, Justice Caldwell's son-in-law. Conflict of interest disclosed to all parties. No objections filed. Case proceeded to summary judgment. Verdict: all claims dismissed with prejudice due to 7 unexplained procedural and evidentiary gaps. Plaintiff ordered to bear all litigation costs. No editorial commentary, no speculation, just facts. The facts were damning enough. My phone rang at 7:15. That's front page, and Grant said, no greeting. Every legal journal in the state will pick it up by noon. A P-Wire picked it up 20 minutes ago. It's going national. I sipped my coffee. It had gone cold. Jude's firm phone started ringing at 7. Grant continued. First call was Martin Fletcher, major client, real estate development, $50 million in active deals. He just withdrew representation and announced he's filing a countersuit for legal malpractice. I set the coffee cup down. Based on what grounds? Public humiliation, professional incompetence. The 7 procedural gaps you cited in the verdict, Fletcher's lawyers are arguing those same gaps exist in the contracts Jude drafted for him. They're auditing everything Jude's ever touched. I closed my eyes, listened to Grant's breathing on the other end of the line. The trial was the verdict, I said quietly. This is the press, the client's leaving, this is the sentence. A first blow has been dealt, Grant said. More coming. He hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the headline, at the photograph of the courthouse steps, at the small inset photo of me from 2018 younger, still in robes before I retired, before I decided to disappear and let my daughter love me without the weight of what I'd been. The phone rang 6 more times that morning. Reporters, old colleagues, Irving Ashford calling to say the Judicial Council wanted a debriefing. I answered none of them. I just sat and waited. 2 days later, she came. I heard the car in the driveway at 10 in the morning, looked out the window. Luciana's sedan, alone, no Jude. She got out, walked to the door, knocked once. I opened it. She stood there in jeans and a sweater I remembered from 3 years ago. No makeup, hair pulled back. She looked exhausted. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. She walked past me into the kitchen, stopped when she saw the table. I'd laid it all out that morning. Everything. The complete evidence stack Conrad Kemp had compiled. The embezzlement records showing payments skimmed over 18 months. The forged mortgage documents with the authentication analysis proving Luciana's signature was fake. The conservatorship filing plan with the fake medical records Jude had commissioned. 473 pages, organized in manila folders, labeled, waiting. Luciana stood there looking at them. Didn't move, didn't speak. "Sit," I said. "Read, I'll make tea." She sat, pulled the first folder toward her, opened it. I filled the kettle, put it on the stove, got 2 cups down from the cabinet, found the tea bag she used to like when she was younger, Earl Grey. I didn't know if she still drank it. Behind me, I heard pages turning, slow, steady, no gasps, no exclamations, just silence. The kettle boiled. I poured water, let the tea steep, set 1 cup beside her. She didn't look up. I sat across from her, drank my tea, watched her read. First folder, second, third. The embezzlement trail. Client payments that should have been $15,000 showing up in her business account as $10,000. The missing $5,000 rerouted through Apex Design, Holdings Jude's shell company. She turned pages. Her face didn't change. Fourth folder, fifth, the mortgage fraud. Her signature on the loan documents, the forensic analysis showing 95% similarity, but conclusive evidence of forgery. The bank statements showing Jude depositing the money into accounts she'd never seen. She kept reading. Sixth folder, seventh, the conservatorship plan. The fake medical records stating she was mentally incompetent. The legal filing scheduled for November 15th, 3 weeks from the trial date. The plan to declare her unfit seize control of her assets and file for divorce once he had everything. 40 minutes. She read for 40 minutes without speaking, without stopping, without looking at me once. Then she closed the last folder, put both hands flat on the table, stared at the stack. I waited. "He did all this without my knowledge," she said. Not a question, a statement, flat, factual. The embezzlement, the forged mortgage, the conservatorship plan, all of it. "Yes," I said. She looked up at me. Her eyes were dry, clear, focused. "You knew nothing, Lucy," I said. "You were the victim, not the accomplice. Conrad's investigation confirmed that. Grant's legal analysis confirmed that. Every piece of evidence in these folders confirms that." I leaned forward. "But now you know," I said. "Now it's time to decide what you're going to do about it." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone. My chest tightened. Was she calling Jude, warning him, going back to him despite everything she'd just read? She unlocked the screen, scrolled through contacts, found a name, pressed call, held the phone to her ear. "Amanda," she said. Her voice was steady, calm. "It's Luciana Caldwell. I need to retain you. Family law. I need to file for legal separation. And I need protection from my husband's financial schemes. Can you meet me today?" She wasn't calling her husband. She was calling her lawyer. She hung up the phone, looked at me. "Amanda says I need to file the evidence with the authorities, not just for protection, for prosecution." I nodded. "Conrad put everything together specifically for that purpose. It's ready." 3 days later, Luciana walked into the Pennsylvania Economic Crimes Unit and handed them everything. Every bank statement showing the skim payments, every forged document, every piece of evidence that proved what Jude had done. 473 pages. Grant called me 48 hours after that. "Economic crimes move fast," he said. "Jude's accounts frozen as of this morning. Personal accounts, business accounts, everything. Total freeze pending investigation." I was standing at my kitchen window, looking out at the woods behind the cabin. November had turned the trees bare, skeletal branches against gray sky. "How much?" I asked. Everything he had access to. The stolen funds plus his own assets. Roughly 1.3 million total. He can't touch any of it. I closed my eyes, felt the phone warm against my ear. "And that's the first blow," I said. "Yes," Grant said, "and it won't be the last." He was right. 4 days later, November 9th, Grant called again. "A state bar counsel just suspended his license," he said. "Emergency action based on the Judicial Council's formal report. The trial misconduct, the fraud allegations, the frozen accounts. They suspended him pending a full ethics hearing scheduled for December." "He can't practice law," I said. Not a question, a statement. Can't represent clients, can't appear in court, can't earn. A financial lawyer who can't practice law. I walked to the calendar hanging on my kitchen wall, the one I'd been using to track everything since October. I picked up the pen I kept on the counter, drew a single line through November 9th. 2 lines now, 2 blows. 2 down. "Poetic," I said quietly. "What?" "Nothing, thank you, Grant." I hung up, stood there looking at the calendar. October 27th, the trial. November 2nd, accounts frozen. November 9th, license suspended. 2 pillars of Jude's life, money and profession, both gone in a week. I wondered how long it would take for the rest to fall. 6 days. Grant called on November 15th. "And if Fletcher judgment came through," he said. "Summary judgment. Court awarded $450,000 in damages and legal fees. Against Jude personally, not the firm. He's liable." Can he pay?" I asked. "Everything he has is frozen or already gone. He can't pay anything. Fletcher's lawyers filed a lien against any future assets. They'll be first in line if he ever earns again." I drew another line through November 15th. 3. 3 blows, 3 pillars, the money frozen, the license gone, the professional reputation destroyed. 1 pillar left. It fell 8 days later. Grant's call came on November 23rd. Early morning, 7:15. I was making coffee when the phone rang. "Bankruptcy filing just hit the public record," Grant said. Chapter 7, complete liquidation. 3 additional clients filed malpractice claims after the Fletcher publicity. Creditors started accelerating collection. Jude couldn't fight it. I poured coffee into my cup, watched the steam rise. "When did he file?" "Yesterday afternoon. It's public as of midnight." I set the pot down, walked to the calendar, drew the 4th line. 4 lines in 21 days. 4 pillars supporting Jude Harlan's life. Money, license, reputation, solvency. Each one crossed out. Each one collapsed. I stood there looking at those 4 lines. 4 simple pen strokes marking the systematic destruction of a man who thought he could steal from his wife, forge her signature, and declare her incompetent to take everything she'd built. A man who'd thought age meant weakness. Who'd thought silence meant powerless. Who'd been wrong. 21 days, Grant said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. From successful financial lawyer to bankrupt, from licensed attorney to suspended, from everything to nothing. He paused. "Russell," he said, "it's over." I looked at the calendar, at the 4 lines, at the dates marking each blow. Trial on the 27th, assets frozen by the 2nd, license suspended by the 9th, Judgment against him by the 15th. Bankruptcy filed by the 23rd. Systematic, inevitable. Justice delivered through institutional channels the way it was supposed to be delivered. The money frozen, the license suspended, the bankruptcy filed, the reputation destroyed. Was that enough? Was that justice? I thought about the 25 years I'd spent hiding who I was because I'd been afraid my daughter would love the title instead of the man. And I thought about the one thing that legal victory and institutional justice and bankruptcy filings couldn't provide: closure. Not for the courts, not for the state bar, not for the creditors standing in line to collect what they were owed. For me. And no, I said. Grant went quiet on the other end of the line. What? Not finished yet, I said. There's one last thing I need to do before this is truly over. Russell the man has nothing left. His accounts are frozen. His license is suspended. He's bankrupt. His wife is leaving him. His clients are suing him. What else is there, Ikobi? I looked out the window, at the bare trees, at the gray November sky. It's something the courts can't give me, I said. Something only I can finish. I hung up before Grant could ask what I meant. Stood there holding my coffee, feeling the warmth of the cup against my palms. 4 blows in 21 days, 4 pillars collapsed. But there was still one thing left. One conversation. One moment. One final piece of closure that no verdict or bankruptcy filing could provide. I needed to see Jude Harlan one last time. Not as a judge, not as a father-in-law, not as the man who'd destroyed his life through legal channels. As the man he'd pushed aside in a courthouse lobby and called weak. I needed him to understand exactly who I'd always been. And I needed to hear him say it. The one last thing wasn't revenge or justice. It wasn't confronting Jude. It wasn't watching him lose everything. It wasn't standing over the wreckage of his life and demanding acknowledgement. It was waiting for my daughter to choose herself. Luciana filed for divorce on November 28th. Expedited dissolution, citing financial abuse, fraud, and coercion. Her attorney, Amanda. The family lawyer she'd called from my kitchen table pushed it through on an accelerated timeline. In the United States family court system, cases involving documented financial abuse and ongoing criminal investigation get priority, especially when the abuser's assets are frozen and he's facing multiple lawsuits and ethics charges, especially when the evidence is clear, irrefutable, 473 pages clear. Jude was in no position to contest, no position to delay, no position to negotiate. He had no position at all. Amanda called me on November 30th with an update. Court granted the expedited petition, she said. Given the documented fraud and the ongoing criminal investigation, the judge fast-tracked the dissolution. Your daughter will be legally free as of December 1st. 30 days. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of manipulation and theft and humiliation and control. 5 years of my daughter slowly disappearing into someone I didn't recognize. Undone in 30 days. The system works faster when the evidence is clear. I stood in my kitchen after Amanda's call, looked at the calendar on the wall, at the 4 lines I'd drawn marking Jude's collapse, at the date circled in red, December 1st. Tomorrow, this was the one last thing. Not destroying Jude. That was justice. That was what the courts did, what the state bar did, what the creditors and the bankruptcy trustee and the economic crimes unit did. This Luciana's freedom to choose a different life, this was something else. This was her getting herself back. I went to bed early that night, couldn't sleep, lay there staring at the ceiling thinking about what freedom meant, what it cost, what it looked like on the other side of 5 years in a marriage built on lies. The phone rang at 9:07 the next morning, December 1st. I was outside, standing in the garden behind the cabin, the same patch of dirt where I'd been standing 5 months earlier when Conrad Kemp called to say he'd found evidence. When this whole thing started, the ground was frozen now. November had stripped the trees bare. December had turned the earth hard. I pulled the phone from my pocket, looked at the screen. Luciana, I answered. Dad. Her voice was soft, softer than I'd heard it in 5 years, softer than when she'd sat on the bench outside the courtroom, softer than when she'd read the evidence at my kitchen table, soft the way it used to be when she was 7 years old, and I'd pick her up from school and she'd tell me about her day. It's done, she said. The divorce is final. I'm free. I closed my eyes, felt the cold December air on my face, felt the phone warm against my ear. Yes, child, I said. It's done. You're free now. Silence on the other end, not empty silence. Full silence. The kind that holds everything you can't say out loud. I stood there in the garden, in the exact spot where I had received the first call, where I had learned about the embezzlement and the forged mortgage and the conservatorship plan, where I had made the decision to stop hiding and become a judge again. 5 months ago, I was standing here alone, a father who lost his daughter to a man who saw her as a resource to exploit. Now I was standing here as a father again. She stopped, started again. Can we come this weekend? I want them to know you. I want to try again. I turned around, looked at the cabin, the place I'd hidden for 5 years, the place I'd been ashamed of because it wasn't big enough, wasn't nice enough, wasn't impressive enough for a man who'd been a Supreme Court justice. The place Jude had looked at with cold calculation that first Thanksgiving and dismissed as worthless. The place I'd despised because it represented everything I'd lost. My wife, my career, my relationship with my daughter. I looked at it now, really looked at it. The windows I'd repaired myself, the porch I'd rebuilt, the garden where I was standing, the kitchen table where Luciana had read the evidence and made the choice to leave, the wooden bench in the hallway where she used to sit when she was sick. The same building, different meaning. Not a hiding place anymore, not a monument to loss. Home. The place my grandchildren would visit, the place my daughter was asking to bring them, the place where we could start over. "Okay, Lucy," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "I'll make dinner, bring the kids home." I heard her breath catch, then release. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "Thank you for everything, for the trial, for the evidence, for waiting, for still being here." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in the frozen garden, phone in my hand, looking at the cabin. The revenge was complete. The justice was done. Jude had lost everything: money, license, reputation, freedom, family. The courts had ruled. The institutions had responded. The system had worked. But this wasn't about Jude at all. This was about a father and daughter finding each other again. About 2 little girls who would sit at my kitchen table and eat dinner. About Luciana's voice saying "Dad" without hesitation or fear or shame. This was about family coming home. And this moment right here, standing in my garden on the first day of December with my daughter's words still echoing in my ear, this was what it had always been for. Saturday came. Didn't know their mother had grieved me. Didn't know about the trial or the evidence or the divorce or any of it. To them, I was just Grandpa, the man their mother had told them about, the hero of justice. Simple as that. Isolde climbed down from Luciana's arms and walked straight to the old sofa, the one I'd sat on alone for 5 years. She climbed up bouncing once to test the springs, then looked at me. "Grandpa, Mama says you were a judge," she said. "What's a judge?" I sat down beside her. She was so small the cushions nearly swallowed her. "A judge," I said slowly, "is someone who listens to both sides of a story and tries to figure out what's fair, what's right." "Exactly like that." She nodded, satisfied. Then she leaned against me, just leaned, trusting. The way children trust before the world teaches them not to. I put my arm around her, felt the warm weight of her small body against my side, a feeling I hadn't felt since Luciana was this age. 26 years. I'd thought I'd forgotten what it felt like to hold a child. I hadn't forgotten. Luciana stood in the doorway watching us. Henley was exploring the kitchen opening cabinets, fascinated by the old dishes. She walked over, put her hand on my shoulder, squeezed once. "Dad," she said quietly, "I told them Grandpa is the greatest hero of justice I've ever known. I want them to grow up knowing that, knowing you." My throat tightened. I looked up at her. "I'm not a hero," I said. "I'm just a father who waited too long to protect his daughter. But I'll try to be the grandfather they deserve." "You already are," she said. The envelope came 3 days later. Official seal, Pennsylvania State Council of Judges, heavy paper, the kind they use for formal invitations. I opened it standing in my kitchen, read it twice. Formal invitation to serve as Supreme Counselor to the Pennsylvania Judiciary. 2 days per week, reviewing complex cases, advising young judges on procedure and ethics, teaching, not presiding, not ruling, just guiding, sharing what I'd learned in 20 years on the bench and 5 years off it. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter for a long time, looking at the official language, the careful phrasing, the invitation to return to the world I'd left behind. Finally, I called Luciana. "They invited me back," I said when she answered. Silence on the other end. "Back to the court. Supreme Counselor, 2 days a week. teaching young judges about ethics, about justice, about doing the right thing even when it costs everything. Another pause. "Do you want to?" she asked. "You don't have to prove anything anymore, Dad. You've already done enough." I looked out the window, at the small garden behind the cabin, at the old apple tree I'd planted the year my wife died, at the pale gray winter sky, the isolation that had protected me for 5 years, the hiding place that had become home. "Yes," I said. "I think it's time, not to prove anything, but because I finally know who I am when I'm not hiding, and that man still has something to give." I heard her smile through the phone. "Then you should do it," she said. "The girls and I will come visit on your off days. We'll make it work." "Yes," I said, "we will." Christmas Eve came on a Wednesday. Luciana arrived at 3 in the afternoon with the girls and bags of groceries. We cooked dinner together, roast chicken potatoes, the green beans Luciana used to help me prepare when she was 10 years old. The cabin smelled like rosemary and butter and wood smoke from the fireplace, like home, like family. After dinner, Isolde and Henley fell asleep on the sofa, curled up together the way twins do, breathing in sync. Luciana was washing dishes, humming something under her breath, a song I didn't recognize, something light, something happy. She dried her hands and walked to the table, set something down in front of me. Flowers, white roses, and a card. I picked up the card, opened it, read her handwriting, the same careful letters she'd used when she was 7, and wrote me Father's Day cards. "To the greatest judge of my life, because it's never too late for justice to be served and love to blossom again. I love you, Dad. Luciana Isolde Henley." I folded the card carefully, stood, walked to the mantel where my wife's photo had sat for 25 years. I placed the card beside it, the flowers in front, looked at my wife's face, the photo from our wedding day, young, smiling, full of hope for the future we'd build together. "Hey, see, honey," I whispered. "It's never too late. She's home. They're all home. We did it not the way we planned, but we did it." Behind me, I heard the soft sound of snow beginning to fall, the first snow of the season, gentle taps against the old wooden roof. I turned around, looked at my cabin, at my daughter humming in the kitchen, at my granddaughters asleep on the sofa, at the card and flowers on the mantel, at the life I'd built by tearing down everything I thought I needed to be. Russell Caldwell, 71 years old, former Supreme Court Justice, father, grandfather, Supreme Counselor. And for the first time in 5 years, I didn't need to be anyone other than exactly who I was. The snow kept falling, quiet, peaceful, covering the garden and the apple tree and the old cabin roof, covering everything in white, clean, new, ready for whatever came next. And to you listening to my story, remember this silence in the face of injustice doesn't protect the people you love. It only gives cruelty more time to work. I spent 5 years hiding who I was, thinking that made me humble, thinking that staying quiet made me a better father. But the truth is, I waited too long. Don't make my mistake. Family betrayal cuts deepest because we want so badly to believe it isn't happening. Here's what I learned. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoring what was stolen. Dignity, safety, truth. When I saw my daughter's tears in that courtroom, I knew this was never about destroying Jude. It was about freeing Luciana. And I believe God's timing brought everything together exactly when it needed to happen. The evidence, the recall, the trial. Not a day earlier, not a day later. When you face family betrayal, remember this. Protecting someone you love isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing you can do, even when it costs everything. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed silent or acted sooner? Comment A if you think I did right. B if you'd handle it differently. If this story resonated, please share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe to Revenge Dad for more stories about standing up when it matters. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Your time means more than you know. One final note: this story contains fictionalized elements for storytelling and reflection. What matters most is the message, and I hope it stays with you.